Good evening. Welcome to tonight's Tools for Civic Action in Our Democracy Now session. I'm Kim Dean Anderson, Associate Director of Community Relationships and UR Downtown at the University of Richmond's Bonner Center for Civic Engagement, and I'm delighted to host tonight's conversation on collective self-care. This is an RVA Engage series hosted by the University of Richmond's Bonner Center for Civic Engagement, the VCU Center for Community Engagement and Impact, and the Community Foundation for a Greater Richmond. The series was created so we might reflect about our democracy now and the deep divisions in our country and region, and build tools for us to move forward together. Tonight, I stand on land that was at the time of British arrival, the territory of the Powhatan people. As we gather online, I'd also like to take a moment to consider the legacy of colonization in our technology systems and society. We benefit today from equipment and connectivity not available to many Indigenous communities. Technologies whose carbon footprints contribute to our changing climate and disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples worldwide. Now, before I introduce our speaker, some housekeeping. I encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature on your Zoom toolbar. Also, we have enabled closed captioning for this event. Please be aware that the transcription may contain errors. You can toggle the feature on or off by clicking the live captions button and selecting show or hide subtitles. This event is based on values of mutual respect among our presenters and audience. We reserve the right to remove any audience member whose behaviors counter this expectation. We are recording this event, which will be posted on the RVA Engage website. And now I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speaker. Ashley Williams is a yoga therapist and mindfulness educator with 12 years experience in the fields of education, behavioral and mental health, and community programming in Richmond, Virginia, and surrounding areas. As a builder and weaver, she bridges mindfulness, diversity, wellness, and inclusion on micro and macro levels to achieve equitable, socially stable, and conscious spaces for individual and collective care. Ashley has a Bachelor's of Arts degree in psychology from the University of Virginia and a Master's of Science degree in yoga therapy from Maryland University of Integrative Health, which guides her heart-centered work, focusing on the mind, body, spirit, and social well-being. She is the founder of BareSoul Yoga and Wellness, a community-based organization initially created to offer accessible yoga offerings, and Mindful on Life, a curriculum-based program dedicated to transforming community through the practice of mindfulness education. As an advocate for diverse representation, accessible self-care, and overall well-being, she has strategically built community-centered yoga and mindfulness programs in schools, health systems, government agencies, faith-based organizations, and businesses as an employee, consultant, and partner. Ashley continues to create spaces that offer mindful-based living practices to encourage self-exploration, awareness, authenticity, and build community for the collective good. From 2012 to 2018, Ashley worked for the Virginia Department of Juvenile Justice Reentry Unit as a mentor program coordinator that centered mindful relationship building between incarcerated youth and community members as they transitioned back into the community. In August 2020, Ashley became the mindfulness director at MLK Junior Middle School in Richmond under the leadership of Dr. Ram Bagad to oversee and implement mindful-based restorative practices as a trauma response practice to offer whole school support for students, staff, parents, and community members. As a Black woman and Richmond resident, she has spent the past few years studying and understanding Richmond's role in the 400-year history of slavery in our country and the effects of systemic oppression on well-being for all identities. Recently, Ashley has been featured locally and globally in the Richmond Magazine, Yoga Journal, and other publications for using yoga and mindfulness to reclaim historically oppressive spaces, address trauma's impact on the whole person, and build community resilience. Today, Ashley continues to move forward in speaking and creating space for individuals to explore all facets of social identity, explore self-awareness, and to gain tools to place skills into action that develop high social impact. And with that, I will turn it over to my friend, Ashley Williams.
Okay, good evening. Thank you, Kim and RVA Engage, for inviting me to be and co-create this space with you all for the second session of Tools for Civic Engagement in Our Democracy Now. I am humbled and honored to share space with the VCU Center for Community Engagement and Impact, the University of Richmond's Bonner Center for Civic Engagement, and the Community Foundation, all organizations in Richmond that I have had the honor and the pleasure of co-creating and collaborating space with. So as I do in most spaces, understanding that we are all coming into this 6:30 hour with varying experiences and things happening in our daily lives, I'd like to start us off with a centering practice just to arrive and connect in our time together. And so I am sure that you all are familiar with mindful moments. So this is going to be our first introduction to today's conversation. So wherever you are, right? You might be at home, you might be in a chair, or you might be in your office or a desk. You might even choose to do this in the bed or a floor. You might actually even be in transit and just listening. But wherever you are, I'm going to invite you just to take a moment. So begin to find your physical body and the physical support beneath you. And just give yourself an opportunity to begin to arrive. Just take a moment to pause, and as you settle in, wherever you are landing, give yourself an opportunity to either close the eyes or find a soft gaze, finding whichever feels the most supportive and comfortable for you at this time. And so when you feel steady, give yourself an opportunity just to notice the physical body and how it is showing up for you right now. You may notice the physical body land into the support beneath you, the soles of the feet, maybe the sit bones in the chair. Just take a moment and check in with your physical body and ask, what is present? And then give yourself an opportunity to bring awareness to any thoughts that may be present for you. And allowing those thoughts to just be a part of this experience without trying to separate them. And as you invite in this intention to arrive into this present moment, give yourself an opportunity to notice your energy. You might even notice the breath. And then taking that information, let's move into that space of our intellect and our wisdom. And just take note of what may be the most supportive for you in these next few moments as we spend time together. And so when you feel that you're ready to return, give yourself an opportunity just to gently blink open the eyes, come back into your physical space. You might even land your eyes at the screen or somewhere close to it. And so welcome once again to this second session of the speaker series with RVA Engage. And so tonight I have the pleasure of introducing myself and work that is so meaningful for me. But what's most important is that I just get to be in this space of Richmond community in this very present way. And so what we just did was called an aspects of experience. And usually after that practice, the question is, what is present for you? And so there's a feelings chart that's going to pop up on the screen. And so as you completed that practice, I'm going to invite you just to check in and ask, how am I right now? Physically, mentally, and emotionally as I land in this day, as we come into this session of collective self-care. And so the first step of accessing and becoming mindful of our experience is the check-in. And so on the next slide is this shift of practices or list of things. And so these are very interesting words that we might use to describe ourselves. Understanding that we might have one feeling or sensation at a moment, we might be experiencing more than one at a time. I mean, sometimes we might not even have a word for what we are experiencing when we do these check-ins. And so as we move into the next slide, I'm just going to encourage you all each and every day just to give yourself an opportunity to really check in. Notice how you are, as that's the first way that we really connect with ourselves. So I mentioned that I mentioned in many sessions that I am in the field of buzzwords right now, especially right now because my work and what is true to me and lights me on fire involves integrating the science of mindfulness, trauma-informed practices, and self-care. And to me, which is twofold, I'm really grateful that they are in many spaces and that I also get to hear them all the time. And so today we will explore the inner work, the practice of inner work and the importance of inner work as a necessary tool for civic action, and how we can begin to use our awareness and self-identity to pursue collective resilience. So as we dive into more self-inquiry around self-identity, I want to first start with who I am. And so usually, at times, I would describe myself as a yoga therapist, mindfulness educator, this, that, and the third. But for the sake of today and many spaces that I land in now, I am always reminded in my roles, both in my family and my communities and my friendships, and just the environments, the importance of knowledge and skill and value and values that are present for me. I'm also very present of how the importance of my identity and the role of my identity and how that plays in my experience, along with the associated privileges or lack thereof when it comes to identity in general. So here, I share all of who I am. And so just an introduction beyond and maybe even all encompassing of what was in the bio is that I am first and foremost a woman, and I'm a Black woman, and I am a 33-year-old Black woman. All of them very important. I am a mother. I mean, I'm not a mother. I'm a daughter. I'm a sister. I am from Prince George, Virginia, which is south of Richmond. I am a huge advocate of self-care, and I'm an advocate of self-care because I found the importance of self-care during a time when I was in high grief and high loss. And so I had to redefine what self-care meant in my world versus sometimes what it meant in society. I'm very passionate about being in community and building relationship. I'm also a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And my education has already been mentioned, but all of these things are so important. And it wasn't until a few years ago when I really had to take a step back and realize that identity makes up our experience. And sometimes we don't sit and think about all of those things when it comes to who we are. And I like to encourage and introduce self-inquiry beyond just the labels that we hold, and an introduction and an invitation to really tap into our experiences. So at the end of last week's talk, Dr. Julian Hayter and Anna Edwards had a conversation in their Q&A about the importance of building relationship, connection, and community to address systemic oppression seen within Richmond. And so we know that Richmond's a city of 200 something thousand people, and we're living in a country of almost 300 million people. And so that's a lot of people with varying identities and varying experiences, all affecting how we show up and all giving us a personal responsibility to add into our collective whole. And so it's important as we introduce this concept of mindfulness, understanding the value of mindfulness as a tool to really be present with our own experiences based on our identity, but also to understand the experiences of the other 200,000 people that are in the city of Richmond and use that relationship to play an active role in the collective well-being. So we all bring experience with our history, our gifts, our skills, and our knowledge. And so I really believe that we have this opportunity to create a just and equitable world if all of our experiences are seen, felt, and heard. So over the past year and clearly before, we've experienced both connection and building of communities, but also the division. Many of these experiences due to our observance of white supremacist culture, the landing of and the elevation of racism in Richmond and beyond, the integration and introduction of the effects of capitalism, or who has access to healthcare and who does not have access to healthcare, all things that have been present for centuries. But we have this opportunity this past year to really kind of see it come to the surface. And so, though it may show up differently for all of us and the effects in our relationship to these experiences, there's one key fact there is that we all have been affected in our own ways by oppression. And since we've been affected in some way in our own experiences, we also have this opportunity to be a part of the change. And so my passion for this work, specifically in Richmond, is that Richmond is really the root and the epicenter of oppression that's seen throughout our country. And so if you visit any of our memorialized sites in Shockoe Bottom, the narrative is really clear that economic foundation, the dehumanization of the Black person was really laid in our city. And so it is in this collective move forward that we build authentic relationship so we can be in social impact. And so today, I want to really highlight this one quote by Audre Lorde, which is on the next slide. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And so I bring this in as a follow-up to that introduction, is that as a Black woman in Richmond, I truly believe that the multifacets of my identity and being able to be very fully present with them, and the proximity to certain resources, and then the distance from other resources affects my well-being, affects my voice, affects my ability to show up. And then also with that awareness, being able to use that awareness to figure out how and where I really show up in community and invite others to do the same. So it's really important for us as a collective to really come in to identify what are the ways that we individually, based on our identity, are affected by just the history that lands in our city and that is also seen throughout our country. So tonight, as we understand and dive deeper into self-inquiry about our own self, I'm going to invite us to kind of look at what does that mean as our personal responsibility in this movement forward to continue to build more connection in a way that's compassionate, in a way that builds more community. And to really sum that up, I like to say just the word heal. So on the next slide, I'm going to introduce this concept of radical self-care. So I landed in the conversation that I am in this business of self-care. And so society tells us that self-care can really look many different ways. It's how we take care of our physical body, which might look like, you might do physical maintenance or take care of hygiene. You might do self-care for the mind, and it might look like taking a vacation or exiting. Self-care looks so many different ways. And then when we introduce this concept of radical self-care, I'm going to introduce this concept of radical. It means arising or going to the root source, getting back to the basics. And then self-care is the practice of taking an actual active role and intentionally protecting one's overall well-being and happiness. And so when we look at one's overall well-being, we may look at physical mental, emotional, spiritual, social. We may even look at financial or intellectual, educational well being, right? So, overall well being is encompassing the whole person, in particular during times of stress. However, being able to be at your optimal wellness is actually a birthright, and we all deserve it, regardless of our identity, because we are all a part of humanity. That is our root, is humanity. So radical self-care is getting to the root of what we need to protect our overall well-being and be in a space of our humanity. I also like to introduce the idea that humanity is centered in love. Its foundation is love. And so it's an act of providing different actions or behaviors that get us back into this space of love, to be cared for, to be seen, to be nurtured, to be protected. That is our humanity. And so, in order to step into deep, radical self care, we have to dive deep into ourselves. We have to know our history, our family, our family's history, and our experience. It dives from the superficial layer of what is seen and invites us to be into conversation with our body about what is felt, what happened before us that might be in our experience, what's happening with us in our experience, but then also even looking at to what might actually happen um, as we move forward into our future. So this is why we really bring this conversation of mindfulness into this world. As we also discuss self-care, I want to introduce the concept of trauma. And so we hear that word so much, especially for me in the education system, when it comes to working with specific communities. And so at some point in our lives, each of us has experienced a painful emotional experience, and we've either had the resources to cope with it, or we didn't have the resources to cope with it, which then would have led to potentially an experience of trauma. And so the word trauma means undigested or unprocessed or unresolved. And so I like to break them up into categories of big T and little t. Little t are emotional experiences that might seem to look like a car accident or a breakup or something that's just somebody said something to you. And then a big T might be something that's really affecting your overall collective well being. And so today, as we introduce this concept of trauma, I also want to introduce the danger that comes from maybe even just one single stressful event in our life, right? Or a series of repeated stressful events in our lives. And remember, trauma occurs if for some reason we do not have the resources to cope. So for me, a situation may occur and I have a supportive network or someone to talk to or the resources to help manage that. But someone with a different identity or a different experience may not have those resources, and that same experience might then lead to a trauma. And so, as a collective, this past year, I'm going to place an assumption into our conversation is that we have experienced generational, or we have seen generational and historical and cultural trauma just based on the loss and the grief from lives, right? From things that happened in our political system, from things that have happened in front of our and within our city. And so the effects of racism or capitalism or even just the things that have happened this past year could be seen as a trauma. And trauma collectively can either have can either be seen subconsciously, right? Like we might not even know that the effects of trauma are there, but we also might be conscious and aware of them. The thing is that trauma or stress and experience shows up in our bodies. Our bodies are the soil of our experiences. It determines how we process, it determines what stays, we can determine what goes. If we're stressed in something very small, we might notice our shoulders rise, we might notice our muscles clench. If we get in a situation where our survival seems at risk and our safety's at risk, we might begin to go into our flight or fright. That response right there is a trauma response. And so that's when I bring in the concept of mindfulness. And so I like to introduce, I feel like I'm in the world of making mindfulness real, right? So there's these practices that we elevate mindfulness of being and sitting still. Sometimes we're in the practice of mindfulness and we think that it looks super formal and we have to do this one thing and our eyes are closed and we're relaxed. But on the next slide, I'm going to introduce what is it for real. So first and foremost, I like to invite mindfulness as an embodiment practice. It is a practice in which we are paying attention to our present moment and noticing our thoughts. We're noticing our feelings. We're noticing our bodily sensations when our temperature rises. We're noticing when we feel a gut punch in our stomach. We notice when our muscles tighten. We notice our mood, and we notice all of these things, and we're present with our experience with an attitude of curiosity, like really trying to understand what is actually happening with me right now, with an attitude of compassion, noticing what's happening and saying, this is my experience. How can I continue to be kind to myself in this moment, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant? And whether it's something that we want to be happening or something different. It's also coming and being in our experience without any judgment, without any shame, without any guilt for what actually is happening. And so we bring in this attitude of acceptance. And so it's this practice of mindfulness, right, that we equipped ourselves to help us be in our experience and understand how we are responding in that very moment. So historically, we live in an interesting time where mindfulness is a science, right? Where it's a science. And I'm going to invite in the idea that mindfulness is a way of life. Being mindful is our way to really actually be in our moments and just simply being aware to what is arising. And based on our experiences, based on our identity, our awareness is going to bring up varying things. And so our invitation here is that we are with our experience, pleasant and unpleasant. We're with our experience, whether it's comfortable or uncomfortable. And that simple awareness and acceptance that's when the clarity comes. So then we can then respond in a way that may be different from us being an autopilot. So on the next slide, it just really highlights the invitation that being present means that we're just paying attention. And we're doing it to gain clarity versus being on autopilot. We're integrating mindfulness throughout our life. So we have formal practices of mindfulness, and you might notice them as we sit for moments and we focus on certain anchors like our breath or sound. We might give ourselves an opportunity to focus on our senses. And the importance of giving ourselves an opportunity to do these formal practices is so we can use them in our informal everyday lives. Think about these opportunity or these moments in our lives when we just move from one moment to one moment, or we go from conversation to conversation, or those moments when we're actually in an experience where stress or trauma becomes overwhelming. In those moments, many times our ability to focus begins to exit. So many times we want to withdraw from those situations. So the practice of formal mindfulness is an invitation to practice building that muscle to be in our experiences in which we might want to withdraw from. And so we can look at those situations with a mindset of equanimity. Like, I see this happening, I feel this happening, and then process it in a way that helps us move forward with more ease and balance. And so it's not that we're withdrawing for uncomfortable situations or unpleasant situations. And in this moment, think about conversations as we're going to go into ways that we communicate with others to build relationships. But mindfulness is a tool of resilience because it begins to equip us with managing challenging situations or situations in general that are in front of us. And so, with that, we'll move to the next slide, which is collective self care. So, mindfulness is not just a practice that benefits in our own experience, but it's also a practice that then begins to invite us into deeper and more authentic relationship with others. So, this is the concept of collective self care. I am a true believer that the more that we know ourselves, the more we are able to be in deeper relationship with others, the more we can see, feel, and hear our experience with a sense of compassion, then we're able to see other people's experiences with a sense of compassion and curiosity and commitment. And so, collective self care, the definition which I'll land in this space tonight, is the practice of taking an active role in exploring our own identity and taking personal responsibility to intentionally protect the well being and the actions of others in our world. And when I say our world, I mean not just in our personal world that we notice, but our actual world beyond even ourselves or our environments. And so we bring our entire selves and our entire experience to move beyond any subconscious or even conscious trauma to be in deeper connection with each other. This is the moment when we begin to center humanity. So if our goal, which we hear much about now, right, is equity and growth and awareness, right, to be in deeper relationship with each other, to move forward, then we invite an awareness into our experience, and then we heighten our consciousness into the ways in which we are conditioned that keep us from experiencing or witnessing or welcoming in new experiences. So in the next slide, the concept of mindful awareness is introduced, which is the practice of paying attention to what is arising for ourselves and others in that moment. And so on this next slide, this is a graphic from one of the programs, Racial Healing Allies. And so she breaks down this concept of mindfulness, right? Or for me, of awareness. And so we have ourselves. And so at the beginning of this program, we checked in, we did our aspects of experience to how we are in this moment. So that's just the very first step. How am I? Who am I? What's going on in my world right now? And so then we have this just overall general lens in which we look through based on our age, based on our experiences, and it's how we view the world. And then we realize that how we view the world, like based on our experiences, informs our beliefs, our values, and our assumptions. And this determines how we engage or expect others to engage with us. So our lens that comes from our awareness then determines how we interact with others. And so that mid area from that step to engagement is also called conditioning, right? We might do it over and over and over again. And so the same thing happens, the same response happens in our engagement. We might think something should look one way. So it takes us out of that space of curiosity and commitment to really getting to know someone if we're always just looking through our lens. But if we understand it and we're aware of our lens, we also have an opportunity to accept that our lens influences how we show up. And so that gives us personal responsibility to then maybe decide how we actually show up and impact the outcomes of the things that we experience. And so as we come into deeper relationship with each other, the question is, what am I conditioned to do based on my experience? and what is helpful and maybe what is unhelpful. And then also in each moment, what is arising for me? And so as we view the world, we know that we're going to come in contact with different experiences. And so the invitation from a mindfulness perspective or mindful living in engaging our consciousness is that the only way out is in. And we always have to ask what's arising for us. So on the next slide, as we highlight that we can assume that each of us have different experiences that could lead to certain conditioning, right? We also assume that our own experience could also relate to others. And so this is where mindful communication comes in. So mindful communication is first that practice of mindful awareness. And so it's asking to myself, am I fully and open and present to what values and beliefs are present for me? Am I fully open and present to my experience? This is that one practice that we did at the beginning. It's the verbal and non-verbal awareness of ourselves. And then we have the communication, which is, am I being fully open and present to other people? Am I able to say directly what I need to say? And then am I able to be present to their experience, see, feel, and hear their humanity? And if not, why? And so on the next slide, as we go into mindful communication to build relationship, these are 4 different levels of systemic oppression, but also systemic change. Because remember that we are all a part of this collective, right? And each of our individual experience shows up in a different way. And so the questions that I'm going to invite in as we navigate our collective and personal responsibility, first tapping into our own selves, are these 4 inquiries. So with personal oppression, right, that could be seen as internalized oppression, is what values and beliefs are present for you? What values and beliefs operate within me? Is it that are there certain things that I hold true about myself? Do I feel like I'm enough? What are my core values? What's important? Right? Like how am I operating? And then also noticing, how does this decentering of humanity that's sometimes shown in our world, how does that operating in me? And then the next level of oppression is interpersonal, right? So these are just some ways that maybe language or actions or behaviors that we hold operate through me or at me. So this is the question in asking, how does interpersonal oppression move through me? How do I perpetuate it? Right? And so it's tapping in and asking, what language do I use that may decenter another person? What language do I use to decenter my actual experience? The next one is societal. And so societal is asking, what do I believe to be normal, right, or good? And so societal is, what do I think is beautiful? And so one example for this context, right? A lot of my work is dismantling the concept and the idea of whiteness and wellness, right? Or dismantling and encouraging and inviting people into understanding collective trauma based on our history. And so the question is, what do I believe to be good? And then what do I actually believe to be wrong, both subconscious and subconscious and conscious? The next one is institutional. So what policies and beliefs or practices, procedures operate around me? What shows up in my workplace? How are things structured? Is there a hierarchy that's there? How do people engage with one another? Who's hired the most? Who's not? So just thinking about, how do we display oppression through our institutions and our organizations? And so this is an opportunity for us to just to kind of be in deeper relationship with ourselves beyond just what's happening with me. And so as we engage, we have to be in mindful reflection and awareness of what's happening actually before us, within us, and around us. So last week, as I really enjoyed being in that conversation, but Dr. Julian Hayter emphasized the importance of building relationships with people, connecting, listening, and activating. And so before we move into that space, um, as a yoga therapist and working with the philosophy of yoga, yoga means to yoke in union. It teaches us to act skillfully and radically and beyond the boundaries of our own experience, our mind, our body, and our spirit. Also, right here, you can see organizationally, interpersonally. But if we did not operate beyond our experiences, we'd stay stagnant. So right now we're living in a time in which our lives really depend on the concept of shared humanity. And all the identities, experiences are seen. So that's why mindful communication is key and why mindful awareness first has to happen, because we have to bring acknowledgement to what's either deep within us through conditioning based on our history, but then also how do we actually respond and be in communication with our world. So one technique that I tend to use and I like to introduce is the idea of mindful talk. And mindful talk on the next slide is this has three pillars. And so you heard me say them before, but it's being compassionate. And it lists them on the next slide with being non-judgmental, offering acceptance, being understanding, and being kind. All very what seems simple on paper things, but also being committed to the outcome, especially when conversation becomes challenging or uncomfortable because a person has a different experience or belief than what's present for us. It means maintaining a direct approach. So saying what needs to be said. Many times when we're in conversations of in the midst of change, there is disagreement. There are different experiences. And so sometimes we might want to use many words, right? Or we don't have the words. The practice is to maintain a direct approach, understanding that the only way to be in deep committed relationship to create social impact and change is that we actually have to simply observe, be open, and be honest about what comes up for us. And then, of course, being open to learning and unlearning. And when we're in that space, that pillar of mindful talk on the next slide really invites us to notice what shows up for us in our body when we're learning and unlearning. Is it comfortable? Is it uncomfortable? What happens in our mind? And then being curious if we're even able to actively listen to the response. So asking that question, what is keeping us resistant or what is encouraging us to lean in? So as I go into deep relationship and I work with various organizations, the leaning in is uncomfortable, right? But we see so much more authentic relationship and deeper relationship of people willing to build a community rather than be centered in self. So as we navigate our bodies and our mind and our environments, we notice what is helpful conditioning, but we also know what is unhelpful conditioning, unhelpful trauma responses, or unhelpful patterning. And so Richmond and Virginia as a whole, right, is in this foundation for American democracy. But we're also in a space where centering humanity was lost. And so we're vibrant right now and we're in this space of arts and culture, but we also still have the presence of disconnection through behavior, through subconscious oppression. And so it requires intentional collective strategy that starts with ourselves. And so I'm going to encourage in this moment to take this mindful awareness and this deep self inquiry to create groups, be in connection with people that are neighbors or friends and employers or workplaces. Keep coming back and returning to the spaces that actually feel uncomfortable in our bodies, because that's our resilience. It's finding the tools to breathe and move and see clearly. So then when we get into those spaces, we're able to self-regulate and to return to the deep work that's actually necessary to move us forward. And so as we begin to come to an end, I'm going to invite us into this next slide. Um, with this practice that I'm going to encourage you to place into your relationships, place into your everyday engagements, especially if you're centering this work in your family, if you're centering this work in your workplace. But build relationship with yourself by asking simply, how am I being in this situation? How do I relate to myself when I'm unlearning and learning? How and when and where do I experience discomfort? And then are you leaning in or avoiding? And so I mentioned that already. So we're going to keep going. But giving ourselves an opportunity to be in that mindful relationship. And then the next is that there's a huge intersection between awareness, right? So you can ask yourself all those questions, but the next step is to be into action. And so this is the call to action when it comes to being in personal responsibility for the things that take place in our world. So inner work is necessary for civic action. And so as we wrap up this part, I'm going to invite you to do 3 things. The first one is to name your identity. So I started out with all of the things in which I shared, but name your identity. Who are you? From where do you come? List all of your identities. Maybe you close your eyes and say, who am I? And then just write them down on paper, right? And let them be all parts of demographic, all parts of things that show up in your world, things that are relevant, because it's important to determine what role we play. And so the next one is name the roles that you play. How does your identity show up in your relationships, work, home, schools, families, communities, neighborhoods? What are your affiliate organizations and environments, and where do you engage? That is vital to know how we actually play a role in our collective well-being, right? How are we showing up for ourselves in these spaces? And then how are we showing up in these collective spaces? And then name your personal responsibility. So what's your purpose, right? So if we could say all of us should tackle both personal, societal, institutional, interpersonal, and all of our environments, that could seem like a weight, right? So that's when our self-care might be limited. We might get sick. We might do all the things. And so there's this invitation now to identify your role, use that to then identify your personal responsibility and know that that's going to ripple, because we don't have to do it all, but we do have to do something to create equitable space for all of us. And so as we end on this next slide, let's go back to this idea of self-care. As we get to the root of who we are, we're actually going to realize our humanity. And so this work is challenging, and it can be, but I'm going to invite you to be in daily self-care practices of always checking in. That myth of mindfulness being us in a relaxed or rested state, that is the intention of the practice, is that when we are at rest or when we are relaxed, we're able to see clearly and we're not responding to conditioning. However, we welcome all experiences and valid emotions, but it's the restful mind that allows us to move forward and support healing internally, externally, generationally, historically, and culturally. And so be in mindful communication, get others involved, and recognize that the essence of our humanity is founded in love. And that first starts with the love and the acceptance of being in authentic relationship with ourselves. So as we really wrap up today, I just want to encourage also that everything's going to look different as we continue to center humanity and always come back to ourselves. And so the last quote that I'll end with is on the next slide, and it says, once you communicate with yourself, you'll be able to communicate outwardly with more clarity. The way in is the way out. And that comes from Thich Nhat Hanh. And so tonight, thank you for being in conversation and in community. And that is going to end this space. And I know we have some Q&A. So I'll hand that over to Dr. Kim Dean Anderson.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Wow. I was over here doing a lot of nodding. I so appreciate all of the wisdom. And I have lots of homework to do in putting some of these into practice. I encourage the audience to please put questions in the Q&A. We're happy to bring those out. In our last few minutes with Ashley, one of the things that occurred to me right at the beginning, Ashley, as you were introducing yourself and all of your identities and bringing all of yourself into the space, how do you encourage other folks to show up in that same way? Folks who might be resistant or reluctant or haven't necessarily had that experience before, that invitation. How do you invite them to bring all of themselves as you bring all of yourself?
It's an act of vulnerability because honestly, it's not easy. I think I mentioned at the beginning that it wasn't until a few years ago that I really realized that identity mattered, right?
Mhm.
And that could be called ignorance, that can be called lack of self awareness, right? Which is why I'm deep in this work now. But understanding that identity plays a role in how we are treated collectively, right? And how we are seen and how we are felt, how we are heard, how we are provided or given love or help or resources. And understanding that many times our identity determines our ability to be in that receiving of love. And so that's a hard place. It's something that takes vulnerability to continue to bring up, and inviting others into that is it's sometimes challenging. And so
Mhm.
that's where the mindfulness practice comes in. And so when we lead and I go into spaces, the first invitation is to always be authentically myself because it's modeled that it actually creates deeper relationship, right? So being a model of it. But then also then in the practice of mindfulness is one activity we'll do is just inviting people to close their eyes. And if I were to ask you who you were, what would come up? And guide them through their breath, guide them through being supported in their physical body, if that's accessible, and then bringing them out of that and saying, just write down what came up for you without thinking too hard. And it's in those moments of stillness that we can really stay true to ourselves. Many times we have family and business and illness and health pandemic going on and stress and at home with kids and work, that to say that I'm a mom and to realize what a mom means, right? To say that I'm a sister of a black woman that's an entrepreneur, like to say that I'm a daughter of a father that is self-employed and has health conditions, like I'm all of these things and they all affect me in different ways. Right, they determine how I show up. And so to get really real with that is an act of vulnerability, but the awareness that I have and how I engage in all of those different roles and relationships has been key to diving in deeper into relationship with people. And so the next practice is just to keep coming back and doing it,
Mhm.
because it's a lot of time our identity is in our core and we have so many layers on top of us, right? One thing that is prevalent to this is that I just thinking about being a black woman and understanding the idea of being descendants of enslaved people and it not really being real to me um, until I visited Alabama and the lynching museum. And where my family was from, I saw my last name and I was like, oh, that's an identity that I hold,
Mhm.
right? That's an identity that I hold. And I'm in Richmond and I'm encouraging wellness in Richmond. And just it's an invitation to change, right? And to bring from that depth of me to the surface. And that's the invitation for others to do that.
Yeah, I imagine there are times where things show up about yourself that you wish weren't there, wish weren't true. How do you move through that? You talked about letting go of the judgment and acceptance. And I would imagine, and I can say for myself, I think probably subconsciously that might be something that would hold me back from doing these exercises of what happens if I get to pieces of me that I didn't know were there, that I'm not happy that I found, that I'm angry about. How do I
Mhm.
move through that to get to the non judgmental acceptance space?
Yeah. Creating a supportive space in your body and coming back. So this is a process, right? So we've been in this collective move forward to creating change and through and building connection and dismantling um white supremacy and letting go of racism. Like we've been in that for years, right? It's a
Mhm.
constant thing. And that's collectively. And just think individually, right? We just have to we pause when we need to pause, when it becomes overwhelming, and then we just invite ourselves to come back. And so it's not something that happens overnight. A lot of times I like to say I invite students and people into the practice of what does it feel like to feel supported in our bodies? What does it feel like to be heard, even in those moments of feeling those spaces of anger or sadness or grief? And can we actually be in that? And so a practice that I use even with youth and adults, it's called riding the wave. And it's called you breathe, right? Because our breath is the first indicator that there is something dysregulated in our bodies, right? And it's our first indicator. So we breathe, we come into that space, we get into a space of feeling. We really feel what it feels like in our body. So then when we feel at peace or let go or something that's more of an easeful or emotional experience, we know what that feels like. So then when we have that trauma or we have that stress, we can tell the difference. And it's not that one is worse than the other. That's the practice of mindfulness, is equanimity, right? And that's our wholeness. And so it's okay. It's just that then we're encouraged to do the work to just keep returning because we know that we can watch and allow these things to happen and then release them over time through the work.
Yeah, you mentioned doing this work with youth. I'm curious, how have the different audiences from youth to corporations to folks in broader communities where you're not quite sure who's going to show up, how is this work received? Like, where are there similarities across those audiences? And where do you see some differences in terms of how they show up and receive the tools that you're trying to give them?
Yeah. Well, I will tell you that kids and youth they're so much more curious. You know, they haven't been conditioned. Granted, I work with Richmond Public Schools. And so, one of our practices is creating a mindful culture and responding to trauma in a way that's culturally relevant and supportive and conscious and building the space of community healing. And so I mentioned in my bio that I work under Dr. Ram Bhagat, who's been a leader in this work. And so it has been really amazing this year and previous years to figure out ways to really tap into youth. They're already curious, right? Some of our youth have had so many experiences that have already conditioned them at an earlier age to be disconnected from their world. And so to invite them back into their curiosity, we do a lot of times with movement, right? And so I also want to engage in the conversation that mindfulness can look the same for all ages and all experiences, right? But the practice of mindfulness that's really beneficial for individuals that have experienced high level trauma is the practice of building a supportive space in their body. So a lot of times it's a somatic embodiment practice of moving and releasing and kind of tapping in into noticing that, like, my body is holding a lot. How can I actually let it go?
Mhm.
Um, but then when I work in a lot of institutions, right, that are really based on, like, have the foundation of capitalism and organizational, and their root is to move forward in a way that's for capital gain, right? To really invite them into an embodiment practice. And I'm not saying all, right? So I'm not generalizing. I'm just saying things that are noticed is that we tend to be very heady,
Mhm.
and it's a little bit more challenging to invite ourselves into either that relaxed state or into awareness, because sometimes the awareness in which we might receive could then be the reason why we might need to change a behavior.
Right. Right.
And so mindfulness is not then just a science, it becomes a lifestyle.
Mhm.
And that can be challenging because that work can be challenging.
Yep. Yeah. So if I'm really inspired by tonight, And I think, okay, I want to take this into a challenging conversation with a family member or someone that I know, but I'm anxious about it. How do I move? This was a question that came to us. How do I move through that anxiety to approach that difficult conversation and not let the anxiety get the best of me?
Yeah. So first, I would actually start finding a practice that you know helps self-regulate your body. So know what, so the situation or the conversation that you want to have, sit with that for a moment and notice how it's being experienced in your body, even just when you think about having the conversation. What shows up for you? Where do you feel the tightness? What thoughts come into your mind? And get familiar with them, right? Because that's the part that's going to encourage you to exit the conversation when you start and shut down. So, your practice is taking 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 30 minutes, sitting down and bringing to your awareness all of the things that might be uncomfortable about the situation, what comes up with you. And then practice anchoring into it and finding a restful state. And so that might be breathing, that might be a meditation, that might be talking this out, it might be journaling, but bring that to your awareness. Notice what arises. So then when you place yourself in that conversation, you can show up authentically, be direct, and when an emotional response begins to arise or they say something that, it might be like different than your belief, you can actually see it and hear it clearly because you realize that their experience actually has nothing to do with you. You're just there to hold space for it, the same that you want them to hold space for you. And it might take time after time after time, but you have then empowered yourself to be able to notice when you are dysregulated and then to manage that. So it gets easier to be in that conversation with another person. So go back
Wow.
to those mindful talk pillars, being compassionate to yourself and to the other person's experience, even if it's hard, because it's going to be hard. Be committed. So see it through to the outcome, because the thing is, the importance is the relationship. The importance is the relationship. And then the third is just being curious. So letting go of what you think that they're going to say,
Mhm.
letting go of any past experience that you've had with them. And so I mentioned that a lot with in my relationships, is that this past year has brought up so much honesty and straightforward conversation to everyone in my life. And it has been probably the deepest relationships in all sectors, in everything
Wow.
that we talked about. Yeah.
Wow. That gives me a lot of hope. A lot of
Yeah.
hope that we can go deep and find those connections. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. I could talk to you for a whole hour more. I've learned so much tonight. I really appreciate you spending time with us this evening. And to participants, thank you for checking out the chat and filling out the survey about tonight's talk. You'll also find in the chat someone asked about past events and the recordings. They are on the RVA Engage page. If you scroll down to past events, last week's recording is there, and this one will be there as well. And we hope to see you next week on the 15th for our talk on discovery, mining all of the data and all of the information that we are inundated with. We'll have a conversation about using that civic tool of discovery next week. Thank you again, Ashley. I've learned a lot, and I look forward to putting these tools into practice. It's great seeing you. Thank you, everybody. We hope to see you next week. Have a good night.
So good to see
You
you.
as
Thank
well. Good night.